Welcome back to A People's Guide to Publishing. I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing and Distribution. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 25 years.
I'm Ellie Blue. I'm the editorial and marketing director here at Microcosm. We are an independent mid-list publisher based in Portland, Oregon. We have 14 employees, over 650 titles in print with 20 to 40 new books per year, and we distribute thousands of titles from other publishers.
We started this podcast so that we can share what we've learned with newer publishers so that you can learn from our mistakes.
Or maybe you just want to understand the publishing industry. Today we have a special edition of the podcast. This is more than just a reader question. This is a question from a Kickstarter backer. We offered in our Kickstarter campaign for the Gold Lyre Tarot, which was our first tarot deck, we offered one special limited reward where one person could ask us all the questions they want about their deck that they're developing, and we would do our best to answer them about like production design, all of the sort of technical publishing parts that you do, as well as marketing. So we have an anonymous person who asked us a whole bunch of questions, and we are going to answer them for you. Thank you for your excellent questions, and hopefully everyone else can learn from these as well.
Keep talking for like 1 more minute.
Joe is looking for this on his phone. And
Joe is using a space-age technology to find exactly the secret confidential method with which these questions are transmitted to us.
So what did they want to know?
Normally it's through our star deck. They want to know, and it's sort of a stacked series of tangential questions that build upon each other. Is it better to work with one artist for a deck or multiple artists?
Ooh, that is a really good question.
Start there. And then they offer a series of their own arguments, which I take to be a reflection of their own internal thinking on the process. And I will read that to you because that might help to get us started. Not that we ever have any shortage of things to say. On one hand, multiple artists means a lot of different styles and showcasing a lot of different people. But that means a lot of invoices and contracts.
Yes, it does.
One artist means a consistent style, but if something happens, or, such as delays, or the artist is unable to continue, you can be SOL. Based on the fact that they use the term SOL, I assume they may be closer to our age. I understand didn't have quite the same issue since it uses photography, but it was all done by one person. Oh, I think they're talking about Gold Lyre.
Yes. That was all done by one designer, but it's like, in that case, the designer and the sort of like tarot expert were partners in the deck, so they both had equal investment.
And the answer is fundamentally that you should use one artist, designer, illustrator for a project, typically, unless the project is like an anthology or something, because really the reasons for this are assuming that you want the project to have life beyond the Kickstarter project, which I would hope that you do, because I think a lot of people get stuck in that thinking where they're like, oh, I'll just do it and then it's done, and then it will go to every single person on earth who is interested in it. Unless, of course, they're born the day after the Kickstarter project ends. But, so, the thing to consider here is that most things that are multiple artists, especially in the development and in the visuals, just don't convey a professionalism. It has sort of an amateur appearance to it, because you can tell right away, you can tell styles are divergent, and even if people have similar styles, it sort of like begets the question of like, why was this done this way? And and it almost sounds bad to say it, but it's just like, well, I guess this part doesn't sound bad. Publishing is really done best when you look at people that have done what you've done successfully and then sort of unpack how they did it and then to go from there. So you say, if you're publishing like an exercise book, you go to the bookstore and you look at the other exercise books and you look at like the trim size and the production values, and like if they have color photography, or how they're conveying the information, how they're packaging the content, how they're developing, what kind of language they're using, things like that. And this is really the best advice, whether you're making like a candy bar or like a book or like a salsa dip. So
I would like to speak also to
or a tarot deck.
I would like to speak also to the concern that, like, if your artist flakes or, has a tragedy or, like, gets a job or something, you could be SOL. This is true, but it is also true that if you're working with 78 different artists, you have 78 different opportunities for that to happen, and it will. And
then the other problem with that is that you're going to have 49 of those 78 are going to have zero investment in the project.
Yeah, and then, like, the thing with, you mentioned contracts, like, the thing, if one artist flakes, you have a contract that covers that scenario, and then that means you only have to find one more artist instead of, like, juggling a million different things. I've done a lot of anthologies, and it is nice. I would say the nice thing about working with multiple artists is that a lot of them will work really hard to promote your thing. And not all of them, but a lot of them. But yeah, it kind of depends. Like, if your goal is to, like, promote a specific cause, then sometimes that can be nice. But if it's to create a product, I would just go with one.
And then the project that this is based on, to clarify, is the Gold Lyre Tarot, which is not like our project. It was not like Ellie and I deciding that we would create a tarot deck. It's the project of the creatives, Christine and Lacey, who conceptualized this and spent years working on it. And, we were just sort of their to-market force, like we just handle things like the packaging and the, like handling the distribution and the printing and the funding and, getting them paid and things like that. So it's a little different.
Right. It wasn't really our vision.
Right. So we're kind of, like our value is in making that work more valuable than it would be without us.
What's the next question?
So, our secondary question is, how do you find a good print partner? And then they say, quality versus price versus minimum orders versus finding a company that aligns with your ethics.
These are really good questions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like they've thought about it, but don't have enough of these podcast episodes to have these questions answered already. So, here's one more. So, I mean, I don't really see, there's like old people wisdom that is like, you can get speed, cost, or quality, and you can pick two from a printer. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think that's like outdated thinking. The thing with a printer is, if you go to the printer down the street, they only have certain equipment. They don't have specialization for making something like what you're making. And the honest reality is that just about the only printers in the world that can produce a tarot deck efficiently and have all the equipment and don't have to outsource anything are going to be in China, And so and part of that is like, as these things become cooler and more in demand and there's more and more and more of them on the market, what that means is that like users want these like cool box apparati and they want like all this fun fancy packaging. So like Gold Lyre has like a magnet closure and and we have like we use embossing to put like actual gold on it, so it isn't just like a metallic ink, but it has like a much more visible set of properties.
But we're not doing it in China, right?
That's correct. And so we found one printer that we use for some random things that is in the United States and has a plant actually in Oregon, but these ones are done in Los Angeles, so we have that on our side. And then but so you want to you'd Google something like card printers or deck printers maybe, yeah. Tarot printer, and then you would find people that way. And so you can kind of get 3 out of 3. You can get cost, quality, and turnaround time for the most part. It's really just comes down to like finding a printer that is situated to print the kind of things that you're making, whether that's a cereal box or a candy bar wrapper or a tarot deck. or a catalog. So, question 3. Paying artists. Dun dun dun. This is not a question, but more of a series of statements. My hope was to use my own funds as capital and then use the bulk of Kickstarter funds to pay artists and fund a print run. But what happens if the Kickstarter fails? Is it better to ask artists not to start until after the Kickstarter is done to make sure there are funds? What do you think?
I feel like there's always this chicken and egg issue with funding. I mean, you're the one who works with contract artists. Like, you do need art in order to sell the deck, but you don't have to have all the art.
Yeah, and it's kind of that thing, you know, I grew up in punk rock, and I feel like I say that all the time, but I feel like the relevant portion of that here is that there are so many people that don't do things because their attitude is like, I can't do that yet because I don't have the money, and I need to, like, fund all of this out of my pocket, and, you know, and I want to pay people, you know, and people are trying to, like, solve the fundamental problems in publishing on their own as, like, an under-financialized individual, and I don't think that's going to be what solves the problems of publishing, you know. And so, you know, you just essentially want to create a fair agreement with somebody where you both benefit mutually, whether that's, like, you know, yeah, you just making this cool thing that you want, or you splitting the money in ways that are equitable, or, you know, you both making a cool thing that you're super invested in, you know, and nobody feeling kind of cheated by that process and or fundamentally misled by that process, you know. And so a lot of that is just in clear communication. But getting away from your question here, you know, really it comes down to, like, the popular wisdom for Kickstarter is, like, raise the amount of money that you need to make the project and don't attempt to raise less. Because you know, there's the famous case of the cooler, if you're unfamiliar, where somebody raised $200 and some thousand to make the cooler with the built-in sound system and that has every possible accessory that you would ever need in conjunction with your cooler.
So none.
And then the problem was that they couldn't, even with $200 and some thousand, they couldn't actually afford to make the thing that they had promised people. Which, I mean, if that is not a cautionary tale. And then now this person somehow, like, leverages this to give, like, get speakers fees to talk about this failure. I mean, I feel like this is failing up. You know? However, learn from the cooler, not from going to pay to see this person speak. And, you know, cost out your thing in advance. Figure out what you need to raise. Maybe rework your budget to make that more reasonable. And then, you know, go from there.
And, like, don't forget the cost of fulfilling the project also.
Yeah. Mailing them out and the like. And, you know, and that is a considerable amount of your own time. So work that into your numbers. But, yeah, I mean, and it's like you know, since we have a lot of sales channels outside of Kickstarter, we do not make Kickstarter pay for 100% of the cost of most projects. Because it's more like a way for us to, you know, how do I put it? Like, get it in front of people's eyeballs much more so than it's a way to fund the creation. Because a lot of times, if you don't have both pieces in place, what you'll have is sort of the ultimate problem where you'll have, like, a really cool, well-executed thing that has no life after the Kickstarter.
And that is, like, the thing to consider, too, is, like, what's your distribution plan post-Kickstarter? And it's, like, you don't want to think of it as, like, you're spending money to make this. Like, if you're putting in your money up front, say, to get the artist to do, like, the initial samples for the project, then think of that as you're loaning that into the project, not as, like, you're spending that. And then make sure that the project amount is going to make that back for you in sales of the deck.
Eventually, if not immediately. You know, and it's like, I don't know, I do feel like I constantly run into people that, like, are creating their life's work, and as such, they're going deep into debt to do it, and, you know, it's like, it doesn't have to be that way, and there's really nothing gained by doing it that way.
The other thing I want to add is that Kickstarter loves to help people succeed. So, like, reaching out to them, often they'll help you out, like find a community of people, and also reach out to other Kickstarter creators, like get a critique for your project before it launches, run your numbers by somebody, run your art and video by somebody, and then if your project does fail, you can copy and paste all of those elements into a new project, and you can use everything that you learned to try again, and people actually do that all the time, so you don't just have this one shot and that's it. Like, it's a bummer, but
no shame in trying again.
Yeah.
You know, especially if you can succeed the second time. I have failed many, many, many times in my life, and it's the important thing there is taking that as instructional information that makes you not fail the next time. And this is sort of the biggest picture question is, how do you market? This might be a question I should be asking people in the tabletop sphere, but I would love to know about marketing strategies that have or have not worked for you in the past.
Well, Kickstarter's a good one, but it's not your only one. I would say your primary marketing strategy is honestly going to be like the cover of your deck and the title of it and the way that you talk about it.
Yeah, and people really, really, really underestimate that, and we have an entire episode about cover development, and that works for tabletop games, that works for card decks, that works for cereal boxes, that works for, you know, vegan jerky. It's the whole everything. You really need to be saying, how does this image communicate the value proposition of what is inside the box? You know, and that is, if you really spend time looking at what other ones do well and or badly, and really thinking about getting out of your head and being like, if I know nothing about this, what would need to be communicated to me to make me interested in it? And so that is almost never like a beautiful piece of artwork. That is like a functional piece of design work, you know. And this is kind of where people get stuck, as they get in love and married to, you know, images that aren't really doing them any favors.
You also want to have a really good publicity plan before you launch your project. Yeah. Like, what I often do is I literally Google, like, blog, very niche words describing my project, Kickstarter, and then if you find places that do write about Kickstarters, which a lot do in the gaming sphere, like the fact that your tarot deck is also a game is really going to help you, then you can start reaching out to those projects before you launch, send them your, like, project preview page, and, you know, just kind of keep your momentum going.
Right. And you know, and really think about it in terms of, you know, the basic marketing is like, who are the people that would be interested in this? And you probably have a fairly good idea of that. And then where do these people hang out and socialize, and what are they interested in, and what are their other interests, and like what, you know, kind of parts of the internet does this send them to? And you don't ever want to think about or just think of your thing as being general interest, because nothing is general interest. It's always your audience and then sort of adjacent audiences who have sort of shared interests, even if like not an identical paradigm.
They sent 2 more questions.
They did.
Mm-hmm,
well, a few more technical questions we have here. What's considered standard tarot size, and what kind of resolution should creators be making their cards at?
Ooh, these are good.
What is the best quality paper print type for cards?
Mm-hmm.
And so the last question is the easiest, is that your printer can really advise you on what house stocks they use and have, because it's not, you know, when you print a book, you say, like, you know, this is, you know, 14-point cover stock, coated one side. Whereas with cards, it's not that way. You are, you know, you're basically using one of 3 options, which is normally either most economical or nicest or in between, you know? And so your printer can advise you on that, and you really should use their advice, because if you're, again, married to a very specific kind of paper stock, and or, you know, you want like a linen weave that is like coated on both sides with a certain kind of varnish, you're immediately making your printer irrelevant, and you should go find a printer that specializes in that, you know. And as far as art, you know, your cards should be at least 300 DPI, and then I believe the standard tarot size is 4 by 6 inches. Am I? Or no, 3 by 5 inches.
Yeah, there's
4x6 for the box, 3x5 for the cards, I believe.
there's a variety though. Like we have some that make mini decks, and because your deck is like going to be used in a game setting, you might want to consider making it smaller or larger, and also maybe making the finish sturdier. Like there is a wide variety. We opened a bunch of decks when we were planning for the Gold Lyre Tarot, and there's some cards that are like chips of plastic, and others that are like flimsy sheets of paper. And
Chips of plastic. That's just the varnish. It's just like a protective, like underwater coating.
how is that not a chip of plastic?
Oh,
Yeah, will your deck be
there's
used
paper in there
underwater?
somewhere.
Consider that.
I mean, in theory, there's paper in there. And so, 300 DPI is really best. Though, if you can create, if it depends on what your artwork is. If it's hand illustrated on paper and then scanned and colored, then 300 DPI. Well, if it's line work, you'd scan it at 1200, and then if it's colored, you'd make it 300. And then if it's like watercolor or colored on paper, 300 is sufficient.
Don't forget about bleeds.
Yeah, and so you want your image to run. If your image runs off the page, you want to run your image a 1/4 inch off the page in all directions that trim at least a 1/4 inch, maybe more, depending. And but for the most part, this stuff is not as complicated as you might imagine. And nowadays, a lot of illustrators use these like straight to digital drawing pens that like create vectored art, straight away. And you can do that too, and that's superior because it's scalable. Like you can print it on the side of a skyscraper without image loss, And but in general,
a cool Kickstarter reward.
oh yeah. Now we're talking.
A card for your skyscraper.
Well, for my birthday this year.
I'll write that down.
Okay. We do a lot of these kind of weird print jobs. We just printed we printed a banner that is like the 16 feet for our building in Cleveland. And printing is much, much more forgiving than you might imagine, other than in cases where you are really trying to stretch space and time, such as like you have an image you found on the internet that is this big, because that means it's tiny and 72 dots per inch, meaning it will only print at a 1/4 of that size on paper because of how the numbers work out. And, so if you print it on the side of a skyscraper, it's just going to be, it's going to look like 12 grainy dots of varying distortion and or being out of focus. So, but when you start in an image that's fairly reasonable, meaning like 150 DPI at a 4x6 inch size, you can stretch and distort it with a lot more freedom, and it'll like not look as good, but it's not, you're not going to be like crying at the results.
I feel like I want to answer more questions that they're not asking.
Okay. Well, we are here for them.
I know, right? We're here for you.
Mm-hmm.
So like most illustrators I've noticed lately that we work with, even no matter how skilled or how much professional experience they have, they only know how to set up images for the web, not for print.
Right, that's true. That is a strange thing.
Like, what would you advise this creator?
Just set them up for print. If they're going to be printed.
I mean, maybe that's something that you talk with your artist collaborator.
Right, and you want to have that
with.
conversation before they're drawing, before they're, because a lot of, and, even the, like, Adobe Design Suite is like, I don't know. I feel like we were having these conversations in 2007, 2008, where people are just like, oh, print is dead. But Adobe seems to have really bought into that, where all of their image platforms are really giving preference to the web. Everything seems to assume web in all of the presets. So, which results in, like, probably people that go to school for this stuff learning it for the web, So you just really want to have that 300 DPI at print size conversation beforehand. So if you're making like a board game deck, and it's 24 by 18 inches, then you want them either drawing it at 18 by 24 inches or bigger. Like a lot of cartoonists will draw at 1.5 to double the size.
Wow.
And then when the image is set up for print, then you just have a nicer look, and you're not skimping on detail.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
On Twitter at Microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at Microcosm_pub.
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.